All right, today we are diving into a massive topic, global debt. But we're not just going to throw a bunch of scary numbers at you. We're going to look at the whole global economy through a really powerful metaphor, one that helps make sense of how we got here and why it's so incredibly hard to get out. And that metaphor is addiction.
So let's just start with the big question right up front. Is the global economy actually addicted to debt? Now, I know that sounds dramatic, but as you're about to see, the parallels are, well, they're pretty spot on. This isn't just about taking out loans. It's about a deep structural dependency that has been building for years.
So what does that even mean, economic addiction? Well, think about it like this. Debt is supposed to be a tool, right? You borrow to invest, you build something, you create future growth. But an addiction is when debt stops being a tool and becomes the only fuel. It's the point where you have to keep creating more and more new debt just to see any economic growth at all. And just like any other addiction, there are some classic warning signs. Number one is tolerance. You need a bigger and bigger dose of debt to get the same economic buzz. Number two, withdrawal. Anytime policymakers even try to cut back on the borrowing, the economy plunges into a painful recession. And number three, dependency. The whole system becomes so fragile, it just can't function anymore with normal, healthy interest rates.
Okay, so with that framework in mind, let's get into the diagnosis. We really need to understand the incredible scale of what some are calling the great accumulation of debt. And honestly, the numbers here are just mind-boggling.
So here it is, the headline number, over $250 trillion. That is the total amount of debt owed by every government, every company, and every household on the entire planet. It's a number so huge, it's almost impossible to comprehend. So let's try to put it into perspective. And this chart does a pretty good job of that. Global debt isn't just a big number. It is more than double the entire world's economic output for a whole year. For every dollar of stuff we make, we owe $2.35. That's not a loan, that's a mountain. And this is not just some abstract financial problem. It has a real, devastating human cost. Think about this. For nearly half the people on Earth, their governments are spending more money just paying interest on old loans than they are on educating their children or keeping their citizens healthy. That is a brutal trade-off.
So the big question is, how did we get here? How did we get so hooked? Well, this didn't just happen by accident. It was a series of very specific policy choices and responses to crises that pushed us deeper and deeper into this debt dependency.
You can see the story unfold on this timeline. For nearly 15 years after the 2008 financial crisis, the world's central banks essentially made money free. They started with zero interest rate policies, ZIRP. Then they layered on quantitative easing, or QE, which is basically printing money to buy bonds. Both of these policies slammed borrowing costs to the floor, making it almost irresponsible not to borrow. It was a government-sponsored global debt pinch. And on top of that cheap money, every crisis we faced was met with another emergency shot of debt-funded stimulus. The problem is, once the emergency passes, politicians almost never have the political will to pay that debt back. So you get this ratchet effect. Debt goes way up in a crisis, and then it just stays there, waiting for the next crisis to push it even higher.
You know, one of the weirdest side effects of this whole era is the rise of what are called zombie companies. These are firms that don't even make enough profit to cover the interest on their own loans. In a normal economy, they'd fail, but because debt was so cheap, they could just keep borrowing more to pay off the old loans. They're basically the walking dead of the corporate world, sucking up capital and talent that could be going to healthy, innovative companies.
And that brings us to today. The party's over. The era of free money's done. Central banks have jacked up interest rates to fight inflation, and now the entire global economy is starting to feel the intense pain of withdrawal. All those risks that were kind of sleeping under the surface for a decade, they're suddenly wide awake, and they are very, very dangerous.
The most immediate problem is something called the refinancing wall. A massive amount of the debt that was taken out when rates were practically zero is now starting to come due. So a company that borrowed $1 billion at, say, 2% now has to go back to the market and refinance it at 6%. Their interest costs literally just tripled overnight. That is a huge shock to the system.
But here's the thing. This pain is not being felt equally around the world. Developed nations like the US have what's called an exorbitant privilege. They can borrow money in their own currency, which they can also print. For them, the biggest risk is inflation. But it's a totally different story for developing nations. They often have to borrow in US dollars, so when US interest rates go up, their own currencies can crash, which makes their dollar-denominated debt payments explode. For them, the risk isn't just inflation, it's outright default.
So how does all this end? What's the prognosis for a world that's this hooked on debt? Well, economists will tell you there are generally 3 ways out of this kind of trap. And let me just say, none of them are painless. Let's walk through the endgame.
It's sometimes called the deleveraging trinity. The first option is austerity, massively cutting spending and raising taxes. That's the hard way, and it's pretty much political suicide, so it almost never happens. The second option is default, just refusing to pay your debts. For any major economy, this is the chaotic way. It would likely trigger a global financial meltdown. So that leaves the third, and far and away the most likely option.
Inflation. This is the sneaky way out. Here's how it works. Inflation eats away at the real value of old debts. If you owe a fixed $100 and then inflation comes along and doubles all prices and wages, that $100 you owe suddenly feels a whole lot more manageable. It's like your debt got cut in half without anyone ever officially defaulting.
But sneaky does not mean painless. Make no mistake, there is no free lunch here. The price for inflating away all this debt is paid by savers, who watch their cash lose value every single day. It's paid by retirees on fixed pensions, who find that their retirement income doesn't buy what it used to. It is effectively a slow and quiet transfer of wealth away from people who saved to those who borrowed.
And this all leaves us with the ultimate multi-trillion-dollar question, doesn't it? It's really the central debate in modern economics. For a country like the United States that has the power to print the world's primary reserve currency, does a number, any number, for its national debt actually matter? Or is inflation the only real limit we should ever worry about?